My name is Liz Mooneyham. I'm an extension specialist in the Center for Profitable Agriculture. I'm kind of acting as a facilitator today. From our office, we've got Alaina Boyd, who is been with our office for 3 years, right, Alaina? A little over. And a lot of her focus areas include value-added dairy, but what we're talking about today is e-commerce. So, just as housekeeping, this meeting will be recorded and posted to YouTube if you have to jump off today. Additionally, there's a survey at the end of the webinar that will be attendance if you are looking to get TAEP education credit out of this webinar series. So stick around for that. And feel free to utilize the Q&A box or raise your hand throughout, and Alaina will answer questions as she's able to.
Looks like we've already got one. David asked if anyone else was hearing an echo. I'm not hearing one on my end. Liz sounds okay. Do I sound okay to you?
Yeah.
Okay. We're not hearing any feedback, but if we end up hearing some throughout the call, we'll see if we can kind of troubleshoot those sound issues as we go forward. All right. Well, I am ready to start if you are, Liz. All right, sounds good. Good morning, everybody. Like Liz said, my name is Alaina Boyd. I am an extension specialist, like Liz, in the UT Center for Profitable Agriculture. If any of you guys have interacted in the past with our Daring to Learn webinar series, you may recognize me from that monthly webinar series, as well as any of the other marketing workshops or similar programs that the center has put on in the past. We're going to be talking about e-commerce essentials today with you all. So I won't spend a lot of time kind of introducing myself. Liz already did that for me. Thank you for that. I have been in this extension specialist role since July of 2025. So have been with the center for a couple of years now. Started in early 2023. I've done a lot of work in the past, like Liz mentioned, in that value-added dairy space. I also do quite a bit of work in the digital marketing and social media marketing space. So if you have any questions related to digital marketing or social media marketing, I'd be more than happy to talk with you guys about those kinds of questions. And just a little bit of information about the center for those of you that may not be familiar with us. So, as I mentioned, we are with the UT Center for Profitable Agriculture. So, we are a department in UT Extension that has a formal partnership with the Tennessee Farm Bureau. We also work very closely with the Tennessee Department of Agriculture. So, anytime you see CPA's logo, you'll see this UT extension and then also the Tennessee Farm Bureau logo towards the end. And our office is located in Columbia, Tennessee, but we serve the whole state of Tennessee. You may recognize some of these folks from CPA. These are just a few of the faces from our value-added team. Liz, of course, has introduced herself. You guys got to hear from Courtney last week. And again, I am speaking today. So as we kind of get started on this discussion about e-commerce essentials, I just want to remind you guys that all of this information is strictly for informational purposes only. So any kind of mention of specific products, resources, or programs, those kind of things are just for educational purposes and not an endorsement from CPA. So a brief overview of kind of the three big things that we'll talk about in this session. We will answer the question of what is e-commerce. We'll move through the types of e-commerce, and then I have some kind of tips and tricks related to e-commerce kind of on a do-it-yourself basis that I think you guys would need to know. So, to kind of start us off, I want to answer this question of what is e-commerce? So, more than likely, everyone on the call has engaged in some form of e-commerce in the past, whether you realize that or not. So, e-commerce is just simply the process of buying and selling goods and services electronically or over the internet. This can look different, a couple different ways depending on the types of goods or services that you're trying to buy. Um, think of like Amazon or online marketplaces like eBay and Etsy. That counts as e-commerce, as well as being able to pay for transactions or services online. All that kind of falls into that e-commerce umbrella. This next slide just covers a brief history of e-commerce. I like to keep this slide in here when I give this presentation. I've given similar presentations in the past. If you guys maybe attended the Pick Tennessee conference earlier this year, I had a similar presentation. So I like to keep this slide in here just because it shows that e-commerce has been around, I think, a lot longer than we would maybe initially think it has been. So in 1990, when the internet, or what we think of as the World Wide Web, started, we can actually see that e-commerce began just roughly over 20 years before that. So as early as 1969, we were able to exchange data through phone wires. And then the very first online transaction processing became available in 1976. And you'll see on this slide, as early as 1982, the first e-commerce company launched. So I think when we think about e-commerce, we think about, the internet or kind of modern websites. But this kind of concept of electronically handling processes or shopping has been around for a lot longer than you might think. When I also talk about e-commerce with folks, I like to use this example of what we call the e-commerce ecosystem. And this just explains how e-commerce transactions, or that process of buying those goods and services online, takes place. So regardless of whatever type of e-commerce you're using, oops, sorry, went backwards. So regardless of whatever type of e-commerce that you're using, that transaction for the customer always has to start on an e-commerce platform. So whether that's through a website, whether that's through an app, or through social media platforms, we'll talk about social selling in a couple slides, that always has to start on that e-commerce platform. From there, you'll move towards what we call point of sale. You may see this shortened to POS. So I know with you farmers market folks, you probably are very familiar with point of sale systems. That point of sale for e-commerce is just going to be where the actual funds are exchanged. So this can be through an online store, through a card reader, however that processing is able to be handled. All that happens at the point of sale. And after the point of sale, you would then move to logistics and delivery. So depending on if you have a physical good, or if you're providing services, or if it's a digital product, that logistics and delivery can look a little bit different for every e-commerce business. There's not necessarily a right or wrong for that. That's just going to depend on what the product is that you're selling through that e-commerce platform. So if you have a physical good, I work with a lot of dairy producers who are creating soaps and lotions. So I use soap examples a lot. Say you're selling bars of soap online on Etsy, and you have to physically ship that product to the customer. Then that logistics and delivery would look like, however you're handling shipping that product to that customer. And from there, you would move to the support and service phase. So everything for the support and service, those functions would take place after the logistics and delivery. If it's a digital product or maybe a service and they're not actually picking up like a physical good or receiving something in the mail, um, then you might skip this phase entirely and move straight to support and service. That's going to be any kind of support or service that you, as the e-commerce business, would provide to that customer after they receive whatever product they're purchasing. So there are a couple of variations to e-commerce. I've mentioned Amazon already, a couple of other maybe online marketplaces. So you may encounter folks who use this variation of m-commerce instead of e-commerce. So the E in e-commerce just stands for electronic. That electronic commerce, which we talked about on our very first slide. The M in m-commerce just stands for mobile devices. So at kind of where we are in kind of modern times with technology, we're able to make purchases with our smartphones, iPhones. If any of you have Apple Watches or Android watches, I know I'm an Apple user. I can tap to pay with my Apple Watch. So these are just types of e-commerce that take place strictly on a mobile device. You may use some sort of an e-commerce platform that only exists in the form of a mobile app. Um, Amazon might be an example of this, but you can also use Amazon on like a computer through a desktop browser. So it's not necessarily the best example, but it is a common one when folks talk about e-commerce for mobile devices. So just think of e-commerce platforms that exist strictly in the form of like an app on a smartphone. All right. So now that we've touched on a couple of definitions and that e-commerce ecosystem, I kind of want to talk with you now about why would you even want to use e-commerce? So the neat thing about e-commerce is it is not only a way for you to generate a new stream of revenue for your farm business or for your market, you can also attract new customers and expand the reach of your business beyond the geographic region that you're in. So I like to use the example of, again, that producer selling soaps and lotions through Etsy. If we think about a producer who is maybe based in Middle Tennessee, they're selling bars of soap. The likelihood of a customer from California coming to their farm in Middle Tennessee and purchasing soap from them, it's not impossible, but it's pretty slim. With e-commerce and the ability to market your products and expand that reach to new customers outside of your geographic region, you can reach folks and a new target audience for your products that you may otherwise never reach with just a brick and mortar location or a physical like stand at the farmer's market. So e-commerce can allow you to um, bring in an additional revenue stream alternative to kind of that traditional brick and mortar situation that we've talked about. And the neat thing with e-commerce is that the folks that are purchasing from you online may be a completely different target audience than the ones that you're reaching in person. There's no right or wrong for that, and it can look different for every person or for every business. But that's one of the empowering things with e-commerce is being able to reach new audiences that you may otherwise never be able to reach with traditional in-person sales. So This brings us to some basic considerations for starting an e-commerce enterprise. And if any of you have ever listened to some CPA marketing presentations in the past, whether from me or Liz or the other marketing specialists on our staff, I feel like we shout this from the rooftops, but the most important thing that I think you guys need to know is to really know before you go into this to have your products and services identified, know exactly what you're going to sell through that e-commerce platform, and also have your target audience in mind. If you don't know your target audience and you also don't know the products or services that you're going to provide, it can be very hard to set that e-commerce platform up and to allow that to be successful. I think the most important thing above all is having an idea of who your target audience is going to be, above all else. And lastly, then to determine the type of e-commerce platform that you're going to use. So again, this can look different. You may want to use an online marketplace. You may use an app. You may use an online store that you've built strictly for your farm or your business. We'll talk about some specific examples of those different types of platforms in a few slides. But these three things are, I think, the most important basic considerations for starting an e-commerce business. And once you kind of have those three things lined up, or you kind of worked through those initial questions, then you can start to think about, okay, if I have a physical product, how am I going to ship those or deliver those? Are you going to only do maybe online sales in your region? Would you do in-person sales? Are you going to allow like local pickup? Or are you strictly going to only ship and deliver and never have folks kind of come onto the property at all? Um, Also think about how will those customers pay for their goods or services. So there are several different payment processing options that we'll talk about in a few slides. And then again, also think about, are you only going to exist as an online platform or as an e-commerce business, or will you also have a an in-person or a brick and mortar location? Looks like we've got a question. Let's see. So David asks, does target customer demographic influence platform choice? That's a really good question. And I think I'll talk a little bit about that now, but I also think when we start to talk about specific platforms in a couple slides, um, we'll touch on that again. So I would say yes. Your target audience can most certainly influence the e-commerce platform that you choose. Um, and let's see, I want to see if this next slide takes us to those. It does. So to answer on David's question and to also move us into this next slide of what does e-commerce look like, depending on the even something as simple as the types of products that you're going to offer that can influence your target audience. And it is completely possible that the target audience that you have for your on-farm retail or your farmer's market stand or your in-person sales can be totally different than the customers that you reach through e-commerce. And I'll talk a little bit more now about this slide specifically and what e-commerce looks like. And then I think some of the kind of types of target audiences or questions related to those might make a little bit more sense. So there are several different variations or types of e-commerce out there. I think I mentioned social selling already. So if you didn't know that this was possible, you can actually sell goods and services through social media platforms, specifically Facebook and Instagram, through an option called Meta Shops. We'll talk about that in another slide. There is also what we call consumer to consumer e-commerce. So eBay is going to be the biggest example of that consumer to consumer, where it's folks kind of buying and selling goods and services as consumers to one another. There's also business to business. So the biggest example that I use for business to business e-commerce would be like Microsoft. So think about how Microsoft sells Microsoft Office licenses to businesses. They offer a good and service or goods and services as a business to other businesses so that they can utilize those services. There's also what we call business to government. So the example that I most commonly use for e-commerce for business to government would be like an online cybersecurity firm or someone offering like IT support, those kind of things where that business is offering digital or e-commerce type services to a government entity. We've talked about online marketplaces a lot. So the neat thing with online marketplaces is there are lots of options. Amazon is the example that I use here on this slide. I've mentioned Etsy a couple times. There are other alternatives. Um, I would think even like Mercari is an option, Poshmark. Those are more similar almost to eBay and that they would be more of a consumer to consumer type. But with Amazon specifically, I wanted to note it is possible that the, the target audience for Amazon could be really any number of folks. You could have multiple target audiences that are using Amazon um, to purchase your products as that online through that online marketplace. And then lastly, this last example on this slide that we have are brand websites. So this is going to be your direct to consumer online sales. So you have a website that you built for your farm. Think alainaboydsoap.com. If I'm making soaps and lotions and selling those, folks would be buying those directly from my brand website, and that would be the direct to consumer e-commerce option. So um, this next slide takes us into some kind of specific examples of these types of e-commerce variations that I've mentioned. So social selling, I mentioned Meta Shops through Facebook and Instagram. This is a way that you can sell goods and services through the Meta platform. Meta is the company that owns Facebook and Instagram. This is an example of what that might look like. So you've got your Facebook page, you have maybe these categories of products, and then there's a checkout page here. So target audience wise for Meta Shops, it is not it is not necessarily a one size fits all. We don't necessarily um, want to stereotype the types of individuals that are, using these social media platforms to make purchases. But I would say there's another presentation that I give related to social media marketing and marketing to the generations. And we can see based on like social media behavior, there are specific social media sites that age groups kind of gravitate towards. So using Instagram as an example, a lot of millennials, so think folks kind of in their early to late 30s, that kind of range, and younger, as well as like the Gen Z folks. So I fall into that Gen Z age range. Those folks are going to be kind of late 20s into the early 20s. A lot of those folks will make online purchases through Meta Shops. So, kind of still talking a little bit about that target audience question as we go along. If you have sort of a younger demographic, that falls into your target audience, it might not be a bad idea to look into meta shops. Now, that's not to say that only 20 and 30 somethings are going to be using meta shops. There are always outliers. Um, but kind of typically as a generation, that sort of younger demographic who uses Instagram more heavily would kind of fall into the target audience for meta shops. We've talked quite a bit about online marketplaces already, Amazon specifically. I would really encourage you, especially if you guys fall into that small business category, do not be intimidated at the thought of using Amazon as an e-commerce platform. I think now more than ever, Amazon is moving towards embracing small businesses. If any of you shop frequently with Amazon, you might see there are certain products that you can purchase that where they highlight this is a small business or a woman-owned business. Those kinds of promotions and tags kind of exist now. Amazon is working, I think, more so now than ever to embrace those small businesses and provide support to those folks. Um, so don't think that you have to be a a larger company or, you know, X number of years into e-commerce sales or into your business to be able to sell with Amazon. That's not the case. Um, and the process is pretty straightforward to get signed up. There are links at the bottom of these slides to sources for all these, and you can see the screenshots here. You can just simply Google sell with Amazon, and it will take you to these pages to kind of walk you through that sign up process. Etsy is another online marketplace that I have mentioned a couple times already throughout this presentation. So I would think of Etsy as a smaller alternative to Amazon. So smaller scale. Etsy is actually geared more towards makers and artisans. So I've used that soap and lotion example already with Etsy, but folks that are making crafts, leather crafts, jewelry. You can even do, I've seen folks do like floral arrangements and maybe, dried goods or like spices. And so it depends. Etsy is a little bit more of a unique alternative to Amazon. I would say maybe a little less mainstream. So if you're intimidated by the thought of working with Amazon, Etsy may be a smaller scale alternative that you might find that you're more comfortable working with. I can say as a long time Etsy customer, they work very well with customer support. I feel like they're very vendor friendly, and the website is pretty easy to navigate. I have worked with other producers in the past that use Etsy and love it, and I think that just comes down to personal preference at the end of the day. But they are another online marketplace option. So, and lastly, those websites for direct-to-consumer sales. This specific website, I use this example because this is a website that was built with Shopify. So this website is called Backyard Butchers. Um, I wanted to use a Shopify built example because we're going to talk about Shopify quite a bit over the next couple of slides. And I wanted to show you guys what a Shopify website might look like as we kind of move into that conversation. So, on the topic of direct-to-consumer websites or brand websites, if that is the route that you choose to go to for your e-commerce platform, there are some do-it-yourself web design considerations that I really want you guys to kind of think about. before you dive into creating a website. So, we're first and foremost, I would work to identify a URL or a domain name for your online store that is not only unique to you, but makes sense for your business. Um, there is, say that your, say that your business is that alainaboydsoap.com that I mentioned. Well, if I make my URL tennesseesoap.com, the likelihood of someone else having taken that already is probably pretty high. Um, there are ways that you can find out if the domain name that you're thinking of or the URL that you're thinking of. You can find out if it's available, depending on whether you're using GoDaddy or WordPress, or we'll talk about a couple other website builders in the next few slides. Um, I would argue that it makes more sense for me to use maybe alainaboydsoap.com rather than tennesseesoap.com or even soap.com, because you want to be able to use a domain name, one that's easy for your consumers to remember. It needs to make sense for your business. And you don't want it to be something that is so kind of vague or maybe even popular that the likelihood of other folks having taken it is high. You also then want to decide on what essential web pages you want to exist on that direct to consumer website. So think your home page, your about page. Maybe if you want folks to be able to have your contact information, the address if you do on-farm retail, or if you have a physical location for folks to visit. Think about what web pages you absolutely have to have on the site. Um, as you get started. And then I think one of the most important ones would to be to also incorporate any existing logos, brand colors, branding. If you have specific fonts or imagery that you use for your brand or business, make sure that you tie those into the website. I think it's a disservice to all the hard work that you've done to put those logos and that branding together if you don't use those on the website. Especially if you're already using those maybe on social media platforms or at your in-person locations or kind of at the farmers market stand. If folks are familiar with seeing a specific logo and specific colors tied to your business, then they'll start to look for those in other places. So just make sure you incorporate those into the website if you have them. One other caveat I want to mention. So, say you go through the process of putting your website together. You spent all this time making it pretty and perfect, and you put it out into the universe. If you don't let anyone know that it's there, the odds of folks finding that website are not zero. It's not impossible, but it's probably going to be pretty hard for folks to find that online store or that e-commerce platform and make purchases through there if you don't let them know that it exists. So I've worked with producers in the past that say, okay, I have this website. It's beautiful. It's on the internet. No one's come to it. Well, then we ask, have you connected it to your social media platforms? No. Have you let your in-person customers say if they have like a farm store or they're frequently at the farmers market? Do you let your customers know that this website exists? No. So, like I mentioned, the odds of folks finding that if you don't let them know that it exists are pretty slim. So, I would encourage you to, if you go through the process of creating a website and putting that online store or that e-commerce site together, link that to your existing social media accounts. spread that information through word of mouth to your in-person customers. Flyers still work in this day and age. Don't discount print media or physical media to kind of get that word out to folks, especially if you maybe don't have a social media presence. Just make sure that you maybe put that on a business card or let folks know that that new website or e-commerce platform is available. So these next couple of slides I won't spend too much time on, but there are some examples here of some do-it-yourself web design tools that are available. Wix is one. The cool thing with building websites now is you don't have to know how to code. You don't have to have went to school for web design or coding or some of these other things. The majority of website building platforms in today's age use what we call drag and drop website editors. So you can see here on this screenshot, Wix, along with several of the other website builders that we'll talk about, they have templates that you can choose from. You can change the pictures, you can change the font, you can change the background to match whatever you think looks best, but you don't have to start from scratch. So these drag and drop website builders will really be your friend if you are looking into putting together a website. And Wix is just one option, like we mentioned. Squarespace is another. Squarespace is, I think they market themselves as kind of a higher end, maybe a more aesthetic option for building websites. So you can see their templates are kind of polished, they're fancy. I think they spend a lot of money on their marketing. I see a lot of commercials for building websites with Squarespace, but they have that again, that drag and drop website building option. Shopify is another. So I showed you guys an example of a Shopify website already. The cool thing with Shopify is that they not only now will let you build a website through the Shopify platform, they exist as an all-in-one e-commerce solution. So you can have point of sale systems through Shopify. They have credit card and payment processing hardware. You can build your website through them, and you can also use them for your kind of e-commerce solution. You could not always build a website through Shopify. This is kind of a newer feature that they've rolled out in the last couple of years. But again, drag and drop editor, different themes to use, that sort of thing. The neat thing with Shopify, and this is kind of, I think, one of their big selling points, is that you can use them for the website, the payment processing, and the e-commerce and the marketing all in one. So they'll handle your receipts, your invoicing, the actual transfer of the payments, that sort of thing, as well as the website. So that's just a little bit about Shopify. Um, Shopify is or has become such a popular e-commerce solution that even large companies or big businesses are using Shopify for their websites. And that was one reason why I wanted to show you guys that Backyard Butcher site. Another option that or company example that I use when I talk about Shopify is Glossier. They are a kind of millennial geared makeup company. They've become really popular in probably the last 10 years or so. They utilize Shopify for payment processing, website, all those things. So that just goes to show that even larger companies are utilizing this e-commerce option. But it's not for everybody. That's okay. There's no right or wrong or one size fits all option. That's why we have several. Ooh, I don't know why it did that. I'm so sorry. We went all the way to the end. Let's see. Here we go. So, still talking about this concept of Shopify. I mentioned there is no one size fits all. Maybe you decide, I don't like Shopify or I don't want to use their website builder. That's okay. Shopify still offers several integrations that work with some of the other drag and drop website editors that we have talked about already. So there's what we call a Shopify buy button and this purple little shopping cart here. So that Shopify buy button will allow you to add any of the products or services that you sell to any website and then take you directly to the checkout page by using this buy button. So it automatically integrates with Wix, Weebly, Squarespace, and WordPress. But if you've used maybe a third party or a local graphic designer to build your website, which again, there's no right or wrong for that, you can totally do that. There are ways to embed this Shopify buy button into any website using a code editor. So if maybe you decide, okay, I don't really want to use the Shopify website editor, I already have a website through WordPress, or I'm already hosting through GoDaddy and using another service, you can still integrate some of these things into your existing website using those little snippets of code. So this next kind of slide will start to gear us towards a conversation on payment processing. And there is a caveat about Shopify versus the native payment processing that Shopify uses called Shop Pay that I wanted to kind of draw your attention to. So we have talked about Shopify already as that e-commerce solution. You can build your website through them. They offer physical point of sales or the payment processing hardware, and you can also handle those online transactions directly through the Shopify payment. So Shop Pay is the native payment processing that exists within Shopify. It looks like we got another question. So we have a question that asks, by using WordPress and others, does that mean that someone else built the website for you? So let me go back a slide. So I had talked about using WordPress or maybe GoDaddy. Um, that does not necessarily mean that someone else built that website for you. I don't have specific slides in here about WordPress's drag and drop editing options. GoDaddy even has a way that you can build a website yourself using a drag and drop editing template directly through the GoDaddy platform. Um, Typically, with say if you have a WordPress site and like you're hosting that through GoDaddy, that just means that GoDaddy owns that URL, but the website is built through WordPress. So you can still build those yourself using the drag and drop editors or the code editors if you're able to build websites from scratch using code. And that doesn't necessarily mean that someone has done that for you. There are some other options also. One lately that I had been told about that is a website kind of third party builder where you pay someone to build the website for you. It's called Eat from Farms. There's another one called Barn to Door. So Barn to Door is a kind of an agriculture or a farm focused e-commerce solution. I don't have any slides talking about those resources, but um, just know there are kind of endless possibilities when it comes to building a website. And especially with these drag and drop editors, you don't have to rely on someone else to build that for you. But if you do, there's not a right or wrong. answer for that. I'm gonna look back at that question and make sure I answered it. Yeah. Okay. And you guys have had good questions. Thank you for that. So again, with Shop Pay, the one thing I wanted to mention, Shop Pay is the native payment processing that exists within Shopify. So what that means is that if you do not use a Shopify website, you cannot use Shop Pay as the payment processing option. So you would have to use something else, whether maybe that's Square or Venmo or PayPal or however you're accepting those payments through that website. Just know you can only use Shop Pay if you have a Shopify website. These next couple of slides we'll kind of breeze through. These are just examples of what that Shop Pay checkout process looks like. And I know it feels like I'm talking about Shopify super heavy. There are just so many, I think, features that Shopify offers that I wanted to make sure I covered all of those with you. But we'll talk about other e-commerce options as well. So you'll know one other thing, you'll know that you're using or checking out through a Shopify website. When you see this purple Shop Pay button, the checkout process will always look like this, and you'll see this purple kind of background somewhere. So that's how you know, okay, this website was built using Shopify because you're going through the Shop Pay checkout process. Now, we've talked about Shop Pay as being the native e-commerce payment option. There are other payment processing options available for e-commerce platforms. That point of sale or physical payment processing, we talked about that already. This would be your Square card reader, your Clover system. You can take payments electronically through Square or Clover, depending on how you set that up. Apple Pay is another option. There's also Android Pay for the non-Apple users. So the way that Apple Pay and Android Pay works, customers can add their credit or debit card information to their Apple Wallet. That's the way that you're able to tap to pay with an iPhone or an Apple Watch. Recurring subscriptions are also an e-commerce payment option. So I've worked with producers in the past before who do what they call soapscription boxes. They're selling bars of soaps. They send X number of soaps in a box to customers who are signed up for these subscriptions quarterly. They may do that biannually or once a year. It just depends on how that subscription is set up. Again, there's no right or wrong for those. That's just going to kind of fit the needs of your business. And this buy now, pay later payment option. This is something that's become really popular in the last couple of years. So you guys may be familiar with Affirm or Afterpay. There are other options. Klarna's one. There are other alternatives to even those three, but I think Affirm and Afterpay are the biggest two. So um, the way that these buy now, pay later systems work, using Afterpay as an example, I would say that Afterpay is more so for like smaller purchases. So say someone buys something for like $100. For every 2 weeks, that customer would pay $25 or what it doesn't necessarily always come out to an even $25. There are taxes and fees kind of tacked onto that. But that gets split into 4 payments made every 2 weeks. With a firm is for much larger purchases. So think like if you go to Home Depot and buy a refrigerator or a new washing machine, those are for much larger purchases. You can use them for smaller purchases. They have to be over a certain dollar amount to be able to use a firm. But typically, the way those payments are spread out is the customer makes a payment once a month, and it's almost like a micro loan that gets made to the customer. So if you utilize buy now, pay later through your e-commerce platform, you will still get paid whenever the customer makes the purchase, and it's up to the customer to pay back that loan amount to either Afterpay or Affirm or whatever company that they use. Um, these next couple of slides will talk about e-commerce point of sale systems. Um, the biggest takeaway with this slide, I just want you guys to kind of understand combinations of any of these types of point of sale systems can exist. So using like Clover as an example, um, Clover has those smart point of sale systems. I think Clover actually also advertises that they're a cloud-based system. So anyway, you can have different combinations of these features all in one point of sale system. This next slide covers the big four, as I like to call them, of major point of sale brands. So the very first one that we have on this slide is Square. You guys are probably all familiar with the Square card reader. When those first came out, you would plug them into your smartphone and you'd be able to swipe a credit card and take payment straight through your phone. Square is more of a retail focused point of sale. They advertise that they cater more so to food and beverage brands, apparel, etc. But it's kind of multi-use. You can use those for any type of business. Shopify, we've mentioned already. So Shopify's point of sale arm of their company is called Shopify Hardware. So again, they advertise that they're the only unified e-commerce platform. So you can build your website through Shopify, have Shopify point of sale hardware, and use Shopify as that e-commerce solution all in one. This allows you to link that Shopify online store to your physical point of sale. Clover, I mentioned Clover once already. They are the only cloud-based point of sale system, or at least were when they were originally introduced. That's their big selling point, is the cloud-based software. It's geared more towards retailers, but you can use Clover for any type of business. I've seen some pretty unique Clover setups out in the wild. I know a producer here in Murray County that actually has scales connected to her Clover system. So she has a U-pick operation, and when folks come in with their blueberries or strawberries, they're able to set those on to the scale, and it's connected to her Clover system. So it's able to basically price out by weight for those U-pick customers. And then Toast is a not necessarily super new, but I think they're newer onto the scene compared to some of these other point of sale brands. Toast is designed specifically for food service. So when we talk with folks who are maybe doing food or beverage or concessions, those kind of things, Toast's point of sale systems are designed with food service in mind. They have spill-proof hardware, so I can spill a bottle of Coke or a bottle of water onto my Toast handheld or kiosk, and they're designed to be completely spill proof for food service. And these are just some examples of the Square point of sale lineup. You'll see they've got a lot of options here. Same thing with Clover. So the neat thing with Clover is all their products are all white. Um, you can usually tell a Clover system by the all white tech or hardware. These are some examples of that Shopify hardware. So notice pretty much every brand has that tap and chip card reader now. And then Toast. Toast has a couple different options. I don't have a screenshot or a picture of these on here, but I've seen now in restaurants. There's a restaurant in my hometown where the waitresses will come to wait on you at the table, and they have a handheld Toast card reader that it will tap, it will take chip cards, it will do everything and print you your receipt all in a little handheld, not much bigger than an iPhone. So Toast is just another option. There are point of sale integrations, so keep that in mind depending on the specific point of sale that you use. Square advertises that they specifically integrate with Cash App, so there are ways to set up loyalty programs, track points, give coupons and rewards, that sort of thing through this Cash App integration. So if you make purchases or if you utilize Square, there are ways to um, send, like, you can give loyalty points or rewards points to your customers based on this integration. The cool thing is it will also save their card information. So anytime I go back to, say, a business that uses this Cash App and Square integration, I can punch in my phone number, and if they have it set up through their Square terminal, it can save my card information and pull that card back up. So that way I don't have to swipe the actual physical card every time I make a purchase. These next couple of slides are just a breakdown between Square and Shopify. So I would kind of consider Square and Shopify each other's biggest competitors. There are lots of breakdowns online between the differences between Square and Shopify, the fees that each charge, the benefits, and use cases for each. Again, I've got links here for you guys to pull those up in this next couple of slides. Again, just another breakdown between Shopify and Square. So these talk about the fees, the point of sale costs. There are transaction fees with either one. And then this talks a little bit about the hardware. These next couple of slides are an example of a Shopify built website that's using Shop Pay in an online store. This is Tennessee Grass-Fed. They are a beef producer out of Montgomery County in Clarksville, Tennessee. So these are multiple screenshots from the website kind of mushed together onto one slide. When you go to tennesseegrassfed.com, it won't look like this, but I just tried to put as much information as I could on this slide to kind of show you guys. Again, as with all website builders, with Shopify websites, you can put in your logos, change all the colors, customize your add to cart, checkout process, those sort of things. The Shop Pay checkout process, I mentioned already that you're always going to know that you're checking out with a Shopify built website that is using Shop Pay when you see this purple Shop Pay button. It will always look similar to this. The fonts may be different. Of course, the logos are going to be different depending on the website or how they've customized that, but you will always have your order summary on the left side of the screen. Notice I put this bigger screenshot here so it's a little bit easier to see. If you have a coupon code, you can create custom coupon codes through Shopify as you can with other website builders as well, Square, depending on whichever one you use. But this is what that checkout process will look like. Once you place an order through a Shopify built website using Shop Pay, it will again look like this. So your order summary will always be on the left side of the screen. The customer will receive a confirmation like this. You can completely customize those. So again, they have it where it says, thank you, customer name. It shows that the order is confirmed. Again, there's that space for their logo, that sort of thing. So those order confirmations through Shopify online stores will look something like this. The customer will receive an email. They'll get that confirmation number on the website whenever they check out, but then they'll receive an email that looks something like this. And notice it comes from this at shopifyemail.com, but it's showing up as Tennessee Grass-Fed. This is an automated email that gets generated after every purchase that Shopify does that for you. That way you don't have to send that order confirmation email. I know they're not the only payment processing or online store option that does this. Square will do similar things. But notice this confirmation email. This is the body of the email. You can completely customize all this. So it's got my order number, the logo for the business. They were able to generate or customize all this information here. And then there's just helpful information for the customer. All that can be completely customized and changed. Um, One other kind of benefit that Shopify has advertised in um, their marketing is the ability to be able to create what they call customer accounts. So notice this is a screenshot that I received when I made my customer account for Tennessee Grass-Fed through their Shopify online store. The email looks like this. Shopify allows you to enable these customer accounts. That way, it can save their customer information, their credit card information, um, those sorts of things. So, say that I want to go back and make a purchase again from Tennessee Grass-Fed because I made a customer account, it will auto populate my name, my shipping address, all that other similar information. That way I don't have to fill it out again. And my credit card gets saved with my Shop Pay account. So it will pretty much, once I'm ready and I hit checkout, all I have to do is hit complete order at the end and it auto populates all that information. As I mentioned, Shopify is not the only option for creating customer accounts. You can do the same thing with Square and Clover, that sort of thing. So it's not necessarily as exclusive as it used to be, since you can create customer accounts through competitor platforms. But just know this is an option if you're using a Shopify website. There are Shopify alternatives, and I know I mentioned I talked a lot about Shopify throughout this presentation. If you decide, man, I don't like the way their themes look, I don't like the way the Shop Pay checkout process looks, I want more control over um, these things, I want to be able to do some things myself, that's totally okay. There's no necessarily one size fits all option that works for every business. These are some of the six kind of bigger Shopify alternatives. Squarespace, again, we mentioned already. Wix, we've talked about Square a lot. WooCommerce, that's going to be for WordPress specific websites. So WooCommerce is the native payment processing and e-commerce option for WordPress sites. You can use other e-commerce options through a WordPress built site, but it's kind of designed with WooCommerce in mind. And then again, there are others, Ecwid, BigCommerce. So Shopify is not the end all be all for e-commerce. Shopify does have an online resource that's completely free to folks. It's called their Starting Up blog. So the neat thing with this is they have articles and resources available for free. You don't have to be a Shopify customer to access these, but they will cover different topics from things like how to start an online store to breaking down e-commerce and marketing topics and other kind of things like that. So that's an option that's available if you're looking for more information. And that kind of wraps us up with all of the slides related to e-commerce that I had for you all. If you guys have any questions, feel free to kind of ask those now. But I will share this last slide is my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me if you have questions after this presentation. If you have questions related to something else besides e-commerce, I work with Liz a lot in that direct marketing space. We've worked with producers and done farm visits before for social media marketing, e-commerce, point of sale, anything in that digital marketing. and social media marketing space, I'd be more than happy to talk with you all about. And I will go ahead and pop this slide up and turn it back over to Liz while we wait on any questions.
If you're interested in receiving education credit for TAEP, just to know that you need to attend 5 out of the 6 webinar series and fill out this here evaluation form. And if you have additional questions about that, please feel free to let me know. I am happy to answer any questions, and I know Alaina is going to stick around and answer any questions that she gets too. So we'll stick around for just a few minutes.